Execution by firing squad. Capital punishment. During World War II, the Nazi army turned these practices into tools of systematic terror. Millions of innocent people were lined up before armed firing squads, condemned without trial, and murdered in retaliation. But how were these massacres carried out, and who were their victims? In this new military history video, we'll explore some of the most brutal executions perpetrated by German forces in their ruthless pursuit of world domination. From the ravines of Babi Yar to the execution grounds of Kragujevac and Ascu, we'll unravel the horrors that marked the path of the war.
Il capitano tedesco mi dette l'ordine di andare avanti. Fece un passo e mi spara un colpo alla nuca. Un colpo solo.
The testimony we just heard brings us to our first stop, the Kefalonia Massacre. This Greek island had been the battlefield for Axis troops, who for months sought to conquer those lands. However, it would soon also become a witness to betrayal and revenge. The trigger for one of the most brutal episodes of the war took place on September 8, 1943, when Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. The Italians knew they could no longer afford to continue the war and decided to reach an agreement with the enemy under different conditions. Among them was the obligation to no longer aid the German army, hand over all prisoners, and immediately return to Italian soil, leaving the Nazis behind. As expected, Hitler viewed this as a betrayal of the fascist cause and responded with the utmost cruelty against his former ally. The target of the Third Reich forces was the Acqui Division, the troops Mussolini had sent to Kefalonia under the command of General Antonio Gandin. It consisted of around 11,500 soldiers and another 500 officers, who until then had fought alongside the Germans against the Greek resistance. However, the armistice left the Italians in a vulnerable position. The Führer's men demanded their immediate surrender, and although some of the Acqui fighters preferred to avoid confrontation, a large portion refused to lay down their weapons.
In seguito all'armistizio dell'8 settembre, in diverse zone di guerra l'esercito tedesco impone la resa agli ex alleati italiani. A Kefalonia, in Grecia, la divisione Acqui rifiuta di consegnare le armi e ingaggia una disperata battaglia contro le truppe della Wehrmacht. Dopo una settimana di feroci combattimenti, gli ultimi sopravvissuti si arrendono ai tedeschi il 22 settembre. La rappresaglia è spietata.
The brutal fight between the former allies left several casualties on each side. The Italians' resistance was admirable, but the arrival of German reinforcements tipped the balance in favor of the Third Reich. It was at that moment that General Gandin decided to surrender for good. His intention was to save the lives of the men who had remained standing. But it was a fatal mistake. Despite having laid down their weapons, the Germans unleashed a systematic massacre. After being taken into Nazi custody, the Italians were taken to a beach and placed before a firing squad. The terror could be seen in their eyes. The Germans' weapons were pointed at their targets, and after the order, they pulled the trigger. More than 5,000 soldiers were executed in the following days by various methods. The Italian officers were the first to be killed, and among them was Gandin himself. But that wasn't all. Other soldiers were ordered to dig their own graves before being shot in the back. Groups of up to 20 men were lined up, and machine guns were used to speed up the process. Some managed to survive despite their wounds, but were finished off with a shot to the head.
E io sentii, mentre ero in terra, non capendo se ero vivo o se ero morto, cosa succedeva, sentii gridare dai miei soldati due parole sole: mamma, mamma, Dio, Dio. E poi dopo sentii qualche colpo di pistola o di boschetto, probabilmente a chi si muoveva ancora, mi dettero quello che si chiama colpo di grazia.
Many bodies were buried in mass graves or thrown into the sea. Meanwhile, other groups were put on ships to be sent to Germany. However, several soldiers were ultimately executed at sea and thrown into the water. Only 3,000 Italians reached their destination, the concentration camps, where they would suffer a fate as atrocious as death. However, despite the magnitude of the massacre, almost no one was punished. The main perpetrator, a Third Reich general named Hubert Lanz, was sentenced at the Nuremberg trials to 12 years in prison, but was released in 1951. The vast majority of the Nazi officers and soldiers involved never faced legal consequences. In Italy, the Kefalonia Massacre became a symbol of the sacrifice of its soldiers, especially those who chose to fight rather than surrender. After the war, survivors and relatives of those killed lobbied to have the massacre recognized as an act of military resistance and not a simple defeat. Even today, memorials dedicated to the soldiers of the Acqui Division still exist on the Greek island, and the victims are remembered annually with official ceremonies and tributes on Italian soil. Now it's time to travel back to October 1941, where the Kragujevac Massacre awaits us, one of the most atrocious war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht in Yugoslavia. In April of that year, Nazi Germany invaded the country with its allies and divided it into different occupation zones. Serbia came under the control of the Third Reich, governed indirectly by the collaborationist regime of Milan Nedic, but with a strong German military presence. However, just months after the arrival of the Third Reich, a fierce Yugoslav resistance swept through the country. Composed largely of Marshal Tito's communist partisans and the so-called Chetniks, this rebel group confronted the Germans in fierce fighting. In September 1941, they launched several attacks against Hitler's garrisons in the Šumadija region, where the city of Kragujevac is located. And on October 16th, a partisan ambush killed 10 Nazi soldiers and wounded 26 others near Gornji Milanovac. This prompted a brutal retaliation ordered by the German High Command. Franz Böhme, the commander of German forces in Serbia, ordered the execution of 2,300 Serbs in retaliation for partisan attacks. This is how the massacre began. On October 20th, 1941, Nazi troops began indiscriminately arresting civilians in and around Kragujevac. The soldiers detained men between the ages of 16 and 60, including workers, peasants, employees, and even high school students. Hundreds of teachers were also taken from classrooms and taken to detention centers. Finally, Jews and Roma, considered racial enemies by the Nazis, were arrested. Around 7,000 Serbs were captured by the Third Reich in a single day. At dawn on October 21st, the prisoners divided into groups and marched to the outskirts of the city.
Prema Kragujevcu smo krenuli I onda su nas celu kolonu skrenuli ulevo. A to je bila jedna livada, ovako bila je livada odmah brežuljak uz livadu. Nisam razmišljao nikad da će da pucaju. U jednom trenutku izlazi ispred stroja nemačkih vojnika jedan Volksdeutscher na lošem našem jeziku počeo da priča.
The soldiers were lined up in rows of 50 to 100 people, and without warning, they were shot with machine guns. The Germans were indiscriminate in their cruelty. Among the total number of people killed were at least 300 children and adolescents, some of them as young as 11. After each wave of gunfire, the German soldiers searched the bodies and finished off the wounded. In this way, they killed almost all of them, with a few exceptions, such as that of Dragoljub Jovanović.
Ležeći, nakon da su hvate za oči, glavu pritiskao što mogu više u travu, potom me je setio sam da ušto mi pada I u levu nogu. I stalno mi je misao bila, ako me ne potrefi u glavu, preživio.
Ultimately, the then 17-year-old boy managed to stay alive, but thousands of his countrymen were not so lucky. While 2,300 executions were ordered, some sources claim the killings exceeded 5,000. The Kragujevac Massacre generated a wave of indignation in Yugoslavia and strengthened the partisan resistance against the Nazis. Many young people and peasants joined the ranks of Tito and the Chetniks, increasing their attacks on German troops. For his part, General Franz Böhme was captured after the war. In 1947, while awaiting trial in Nuremberg, he committed suicide in prison. Other Nazi officers involved were also tried, but few received severe sentences. But the atrocities of Hitler and his men knew no bounds, and that is why it is time to move on to a new stage. We arrive in France, where the brutal Ascu Massacre awaits us. On the night of April 1st, 1944, the Waffen-SS carried out one of the most ruthless reprisals on French soil. But to understand this violent episode, we must go back to 1940, when German forces invaded and occupied French territory. During the following years, the local resistance fought against Hitler's men, until in 1944, the Allies began preparing for the Normandy landings. This would be the first step toward the nation's liberation, but first, the ground needed to be prepared. Thus, the French resistance increased its attacks against German forces, sabotaging railway lines and military transport. On the night of April 1st, a train carrying SS troops and equipment passed through the ASCQ station near Lille. Partisans placed explosives on the tracks, causing an explosion that derailed several cars. Although there were no German casualties, the attack provoked the ire of Commander Walter Hauck, who ordered an immediate retaliation. Shortly after the explosion, the Nazis stormed ASQ, dragging men from their homes and making mass arrests, including young and old people. The prisoners were forced to lie on the ground while soldiers beat and tortured them. Eventually, 86 civilians, divided into small groups, were brought before firing squads.
Aufstellen!
Among the victims were young people as young as 15 and elderly people over 70. All stood firm as defenders of France and showed their repudiation of the Nazis. Some were murdered in front of their families, and the bodies were left in the streets as a warning. Yet despite everything, they could not break their spirit of resistance.
Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est contre nous de la tyrannie sanglante. Entendez-vous dans nos campagnes mugir.
The Ascu Massacre caused a strong reaction among the French population, increasing support for the resistance. It led to an increase in partisan attacks against the Germans in the following months, until D-Day definitively turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. After the war, several German officers were tried for this massacre. Major Hauck, the main perpetrator, was sentenced to death in 1949, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1957. Other Nazis also received punishments, but none were severe. Thus, we come to our last stop, the memorable Babi Yar Massacre. There, the Nazis murdered more than 33,000 Jews, who were executed in a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Within a few months, troops advanced rapidly, capturing the Ukrainian capital on September 19th. It had a large Jewish population of approximately 160,000 people. Shortly after the occupation, Hitler's men faced attacks from the Soviet resistance. On September 24th, a series of explosions destroyed buildings in central Kiev, including the Wehrmacht headquarters. These attacks were organized by the Soviet NKVD before the withdrawal. However, the Nazis were looking for a pretext for repression and blamed the attacks on the Jews, ordering their mass extermination. On September 28, 1941, the Nazis issued a forged decree to concentrate the Jewish population. All Jews in Kiev and its surroundings must present themselves on September 29th at 8 a.m. at Melnikova Street with documents and valuables. Those who fail to comply will be executed. Thousands of people, believing they would be deported, came with their belongings. However, they were taken to Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of the city. The victims were stripped naked and taken in groups to the edge of the ravine. They were ordered to lie face down on the corpses of those who had already been shot. Wehrmacht soldiers and Ukrainian collaborators shot them in the back of the head with machine guns and pistols. When a layer of bodies covered the ground, a new group was forced to lie on top, and the process was repeated. In just 2 days, the Germans murdered 33,771 Jews, according to Nazi reports. In 1943, as the Red Army advanced, the Nazis attempted to erase the evidence. Prisoners were forced to exhume and burn the bodies. Furthermore, many of these men were executed after completing the task. However, the horror eventually came to light, and those responsible for the massacre were sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, as was the case with Paul Blobel, executed in 1951. Today, Babi Yar is a memorial site, with several monuments honoring the victims. There is no doubt that these brutal massacres are among some of the worst crimes committed by the Nazis during World War II. However, adding all the victims together, we find the executions of some 50,000 people, allowing us to grasp the horror of the war that claimed around 50 million lives. Thus, these massacres represent only a small part of the barbarity that was experienced. The Holocaust, genocide, and the bloodiest battles have left a profound mark on history and are impossible to erase from memory. Thus, we come to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us. We'll meet again in our next installment of Military History.